Do you ever wonder whether you're using the right settings when you're photographing wildlife? Well, in this video, I'm going to share with you my go-to settings when I first head out on a game drive. In fact, it's a lecture from my best-selling online course called Wildlife Photography for Beginners and Amateurs. And if you want to learn more or if you want to enroll, go and check out the link at the top of the video description. Enjoy. One of the questions I get asked most often on Safari by my clients is, what are my default settings for wildlife photography? Now, the fact of the matter is there really is no recipe. There's not a single set of settings that'll work for every single situation. You've got to know what all the settings mean and how it changes the photograph, and then change it for the specific sighting. And obviously it all depends on what your specific objective is with your photographs. What I can give you though are my go-to settings when I leave on a game drive early in the morning. And I'll also explain to you how I change those settings throughout the day. Now, it's very important to know that these are my settings specifically, and it certainly will vary from photographer to photographer, but it works very well for me. Heading out early in the morning just before sunrise is a great time to look for predators. So you often bump into something like a leopard, a lion, or some other nocturnal creature. If you're in automatic or program mode where the camera chooses all or most of the settings for you, there's a high risk of not getting sharp photographs. So my go-to settings when I leave camp in the morning is to be in aperture priority with my f-stop set to its lowest value, and that value will obviously depend on what lens you're using. And then I also choose the highest ISO I'm comfortable at shooting at with that specific camera. And most of the time that's about 1600 or sometimes 3200. Now, the combination of that small f-stop, which lets in a lot of light, and the high ISO, which makes the camera's sensor nice and sensitive to light, results in a relatively fast shutter speed, which is what we need to freeze our subject in those low light conditions early in the morning. There are a few other things that I also check early in the morning. First of all, I make sure that my exposure compensation is on 0 or even exposure. I make sure that my white balance is on automatic, my metering mode is set to matrix or evaluative metering. I make sure that my burst rate is set to the highest, and I also make sure that I've got a center focus point and that my autofocus mode is set to continuous. Now let me give you an example of where these go-to settings proved so valuable the other morning when I went out on a game drive. We left camp very early, just before sunrise, and as we came around the first corner, we found a leopard that had just killed an impala. Now, with my go-to camera settings set to aperture priority f4 on ISO 1600, I was able to get a 500th of a second, which was more than enough to freeze this leopard, dragging the carcass through the bush. Had I not chosen these good go-to settings for early in the morning, I probably would have ended up with a blurry photograph. As the sun rises and it gets brighter, I start dropping that ISO from 3200 to 1600 and then to 800 and then all the way down to 400. I hardly ever go lower than that. But I keep my f-stop on its lowest value because we typically photograph portraits of single animals where we want to blur the background. It's only when I start photographing more than one animal that I would consider changing the f value, like with these two little barred owlets. Because they weren't sitting exactly the same distance away from me, I had to increase my f-stop from f5.6 to f8 to make sure that both the birds were in focus. And if I want even more in focus, like this herd of buffalo, I would increase the f-stop even more. In this case, it was f11. And if I want the whole scene in focus, like in this photograph, I might go all the way up to f16. But what I always do after taking these large depth of field photographs is to reduce that f-stop again, because chances are the next thing that you're going to photograph will be a portrait again. So in this case, I'm back to f5.6 with my ISO set to 400. Now, when necessary, I will use my exposure compensation to make the photograph either a little bit lighter or a little bit darker. If I see that my photographs are coming out too dark, I'll go to the plus side on exposure compensation. And if my photographs come out too light, I'll obviously go to the minus side. Always make sure though that when you leave that sighting, you take your exposure compensation back to 0. Then as the light starts fading in the afternoon, I start raising my ISO value again from 400 to 800 to 1600 and maybe even all the way up to 3200 if it gets very dark. And that basically takes me back to the settings that I started with first thing in the morning. So to summarize, in bright sunny conditions, I use low ISO values, around about 400. And in low light conditions, I'll use high ISO values, around about 1600 or even up to 3200. And that's typically very early in the morning or late in the afternoon, or in very dark conditions like this jungle in India, or of course when the clouds roll in to create overcast conditions. I also stay in aperture priority for the majority of the day, and I use small f-stops to isolate my subject and larger f-stops if I want to get more of the scene in focus. The only time that I'll ever consider switching from aperture priority to shutter priority is 1, if I want to freeze action like this little bird taking off, or 2, if I want to capture movement like this wild dog running past me. For nighttime photography, I use a very specific set of settings, and I'll talk more about that in another lecture. I really hope that these go-to settings work for you as well, but please do remember that it very much depends on what your objectives are specifically when you go on game drives. Personally, I think the most important thing is to know what all the different settings on your camera mean and how they change your photographs. Thank you so much for watching. If you learned something new, please leave a like, consider subscribing to the channel, and please feel free to ask any questions you might have in the comments below. Also remember to go and check out that link at the top of the video description if you'd like to enroll in wildlife photography for beginners and amateurs. Until next time.